Someone once remarked that it's easier to love humanity as a whole than to love one's neighbor. Indeed, to love humanity as a whole does not ask much of us. Even a small amount of optimism about the world, or a slight recognition of our progress from cave dwellers to skyscraper builders, is enough to support the idea of loving humanity as a whole. To love humanity as a whole is often really just a simple extension of our own love for ourselves. But to love our neighbor involves actually doing something. It involves sacrifice. It involves supporting the other. Sometimes that sacrifice and support is emotional, involving perhaps a sacrifice of time and energy. Sometimes, though, it is material, and sometimes it's both. In all cases, the desire to love and be loved by our neighbor is part of the human experience. In fact, we recognize it from the great commandments cited in our gospel reading today. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. The scholar of the law who had asked Jesus about eternal life was certainly not ignorant of that commandment. After all, he recites it by memory in response to the question that Jesus asks. That scholar then asks who his neighbor is, and Jesus responds with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, we're all familiar with the story, right? It might be the best known of all the gospel parables. A man is attacked by robbers and left half dead. A priest and then a Levite pass by separately and go to the opposite side of the road rather than stopping to help. Pretty careless and unneighborly, right? Well, yes, but maybe not exactly in the way that our modern reading would lead us to believe. Jewish laws on ritual purity said that touching a human corpse could make a person unclean for 7 days, as stated in the book of Numbers, chapter 19. Being unclean made a person unable to participate in the temple sacrifices. And since priests and Levites had particular roles in offering those sacrifices, they had to be especially careful not to make themselves unclean. In fact, Leviticus chapter 21 specifically forbade Jewish priests from burying anyone or going near any dead person, with some exceptions only for close relatives. Now, please don't misunderstand. I do not seek here to excuse the priest or the Levite of this parable. After all, Jesus does not excuse them when he tells the story. Instead, I seek merely to point out that if the priest and Levite thought the victim was dead, they believed for that reason they could not go near him. Between the lines of what Jesus says here is that we must seek not simply to avoid uncleanness, as the priest and Levite were likely doing, but we must seek also to love our neighbor actively. Jesus contrasts the priest and Levite's reluctance with the very active charity of the Good Samaritan. Samaritans, remember, were outsiders. Like the Jews, they recognized Abraham as their father in faith. But they believed that Mount Gerizim was the center of proper worship rather than the temple in Jerusalem that was holy to the Jewish people. Friction existed between the Samaritans and the Jews because of religious and other cultural differences. Yet the Samaritan does the neighborly act of going near and then caring for the half-dead victim of the robbery. The Samaritan loved not merely humanity as a whole, but loved the neighbor that he found right in front of himself. He loved someone he had never met and was willing to sacrifice time, energy, and material resources to offer support that the victim needed at that moment. Now, we might think that the scholar who approached Jesus did not understand the commandment to love his neighbor, and that's why he asked Jesus about it. After all, that's normally why we ask a question, right? We don't understand something here, so we ask about it. But what if that scholar of the law actually understood that commandment better than anyone else and was intimidated by it? Many scholars of Jesus' time debated whether a neighbor meant a member of one's household, or maybe from one's own village, or maybe from one's own tribe. There were different interpretations, but all of them had something in common. All of them recognized there was a limit. There was a limit to who was neighbor, and that somewhere outside of that circle, if you will, somewhere outside of that was a category of persons that we would call not neighbors. What if this particular scholar of the law understood just how difficult it is to love everyone? He realized how difficult that great commandment is. And for that reason, he started searching for a limit, for someone he was not commanded to love. And then, unable to find that limit, unable to see who was his not neighbor, he decided to ask Jesus. And of course, Jesus does not give him a limit. Jesus does not say, these are your non-neighbors. He does not give a limit, and he doesn't give us a limit either. We are to see everyone as our neighbor, and thus to love everyone. This means being neighbor to those whom we see every day, as well as those whom we may never see. The love that God calls us to is not merely an abstract concept. It is not simply a call to good feelings about others, even if that would be a good start. The call of God to love is not merely a love for humanity as a whole. Rather, God calls us to love each person He has created, to love those like us, but also those very different from us. In every act of sacrificial love, we fulfill God's command and even become a bit more like Him.